welcome to Metagame. This is Christa Lee.
And I'm Sophia Park.
And we have a guest.
Oh, hi, I'm Dante.
Yeah, Dante, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Dante, Dante Douglas, I guess, which is public info if you look at my articles I've written. I'm on Twitter as Video Dante. I'm a writer and a journalist and a game developer and general games adjacent person, I would say.
Yeah, great. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
So before the show begins, I just want to take a second to thank a friend of the show on Patreon, Caitlin Levac. Every episode, we thank one friend who is a subscriber to our Patreon on patreon.com/metagame.fun. If you like, to be one of our friends and join the Discord community or whatnot, then feel free. Anyway, so today I wanted to talk about the notion of how we talk about non-play centered interactive media and what that actually means and whether or not we have any good examples of that. So I wanted to start with the notion of the interactive experience. I mean, a lot of my partner Ariel's microgames were called this back in 2014 on venues like Offworld when it was still up. And I was wondering if you had any examples that you knew off the bat of interactive media that wasn't centered on being playful.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this before recording, and I hate to go into the pedantic discussion of what is what, but it did make me think well, what do we mean by play in this space? Because I think there are games that are non-interactive but are still playful, and I think there are playful games that are I think there are non-playful games that are interactive, right? For example, I would say that a lot of horror games are not playful, but they're interactive, right? And I mean, yeah, sorry to get into a slight tangent there, but I mean, my last game development experience was creating a thing called Diviner, which was interactive, but not super interactive, right? It's more or less like a poetry generator. So it doesn't involve, I would say, the same things that we mean when we talk about play in sort of an expansive sense. But it is playful in sort of its application as an interactive experience. Sorry if that's really long and meandering, but when you brought that question to me beforehand, it really did get me thinking about well, okay, so what do we mean when we talk about play, and what do we mean when we talk about interactivity?
Well, I mean, there's been a few examples of coverage I can think of where, say, when Giant Bomb was letting everything play itself.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That notion of but it's not really a game though ends up coming up every now and then, and the distinction is what was concerning me. I know Christa was playing something today that seemed really it wasn't inherently focused on play.
Yeah, well, these kind of games are this kind of media is a focus of mine, or at least one of many. I really enjoy Mountain is a game that just immediately comes to mind as something I really, really, really enjoy. That presents you with this kind of an illumination of the distance between object and play, because we consider play to be the language by which we understand the object of a game. And when you have to find other methods of conversation with that object, what exists in that gap. The games I was playing, I was exploring the catalog of Art Dink. It's a Japanese developer. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of their No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, which is a really strange kind of lap-based domino stacking game. But they're most famous for doing a series of games called A-Train and Densha to Go. But I was playing Aquanaut's Holiday, which is ostensibly a game about a marine biologist who's just on a vacation and just out in the ocean. In essence, you're just swimming around looking at shit, and you have no real agency. You can map it out, and then you can see a map that shows where all the stuff is, but there's not really anything there. It's mostly just a lot of big open underwater plains and some fish, and that's the whole game. Sony Computer Entertainment of America published this game, at least in North America, for some reason. And they also made another game called Tale of the Sun, which I can't even parse really, but it seems to me to just be a bunch of cavemen walking around, and you can maybe eat, I guess, but there's not really much. There's no sense of obligations or expectation of the player to really do anything, just to kind of exist in that world.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
For me, example that comes to mind that might be a little controversial would be LSD Dream Emulator. Like, I hesitate to call it a game because of the expectations. I mean, it has the sequences in which you're walking through these randomly generated dreams, and then at the end of them, you get this chart of where you got put on the dream chart, and you'll never be able to fill it out. So it uses like a language we associate with games, this notion of completionism, but it does it in such an impossible way that it's sort of like making it meaningless. And so to me, that means that it's not really about the play, it's about the experience. And it's two completely different things.
Right, it's like a subversion of the concept of like a game space in itself, right? Like I think LSD Dream Emulator, I've only seen it through like Let's Plays, basically. This is not a game I have like first-hand experience with, I have to admit. But I mean, it's fascinating in the way that it subverts the notion of like an easily navigable game space, which I think is also interesting because what you were talking about, Christa, with games that are just sort of like spaces to explore and not do much else with, are also in themselves like trying to mess with the player's expectations of what could be in that space and like the established interactivity. Which is why, like, honestly, when I think about this sort of thing, I think a lot about, and when I say this sort of thing, I mean like space and navigability within space, which is also extremely vague. But like, I mean, one of my favorite games ever is Kitty Horror Show's Anatomy. And I think Anatomy is really fascinating because it gives you a space that is supposed to seem familiar, but the whole concept of that game, of course, is that it's a threatening space that doesn't actually want or care for you to be there. Which, like, in a vague, generalizing sense, is I think how a lot of horror games manage this, and it's why I was mentioning horror games earlier, is because I think horror does a really interesting. I guess there's an ethos in a lot of horror games that the player doesn't actually, or like isn't actually welcome in the space, which is not generally something that happens in like traditional mainstream game design. I mean, and when I say that, what I mean is like there's an expectation for a lot of like, especially I think AAA games in the AAA space, right? Is that the player should be catered to, and the player should be given whatever they need to explore the space, and it's a whole like kind of weak power fantasy, etc. Which, you know, if we're talking about non-traditional experiences, then I think horror is an interesting venue for that sort of thing.
So is a prerequisite for play that it's player-centered, or is, like, I think that there's the ability to be playful without it being centered on me.
That's true. I mean, like, I don't know. It's an open question, I suppose. Like, I would say, like, yeah, Mountain or everything.
Everything.
Yeah, everything is fascinating too because there isn't actually. I guess you could argue that the player is the what's the term? The locus of the game. Is that what it's called? Am I using that term correctly? Okay,
yeah,
locus. Yes.
Right,
yeah. You could argue that the player is the locus of interactivity, but it's not. But the player doesn't really exist in everything, right? I guess it's not physically made manifest in the game world. You simply exert, force or exert direction onto pre-created objects within the world, and that's playful, right? So, or I mean, I would argue it's playful.
Yeah, I think you're looking at like whether or not a player is embodied, like whether or not the camera itself can be enough of a participant that it substitutes needing to have like a personified avatar.
Yeah, I think what a lot of these games share in common is that, like, I mean, if we really think about what a video game or game space or game mechanics are doing, it's sort of, I don't know. I always tend to think of it in terms of sculpture and how sculpture communicates. So you have a work, and then the viewer is adjacent to that work and moves through space around it and like observes it and internalizes it from different angles. And so you have kind of a active bodily engagement with a work of sculpture that you're maximizing to come to appreciate it. And I think of the architect games as using their mechanics, their constituent parts in terms of like environment or music or atmosphere, or all of these things are just sort of the architecture through which we reposition ourselves within, around this sculpture. And I think that a lot of these games share in common kind of breaking down the distinction between like experiential art and playful art, such that I wonder if a distinction really is necessary.
Yeah, my next question would be, like, what would you constitute as play? Like, what is play and what is non-play interactivity? Like, when we say that, like, say you're taking the Bartle test for how you like to play MMOs, one of the axes there is that you can be an explorative player. That you're there to see the entire space, and to me that would constitute exploration being a form of play. So when we talk about, say, Gone Home, a game about exploration, is that like playful or is that not playful? It's definitely still interactive.
I mean, this is sort of why I was bringing up originally, like, I think we do have to define play here, because I feel like I'm personally a fan. This is going to sound like a little weird to say, I guess, in this realm, but like, I'm personally a fan of saying that play has to do something with joy. And I feel like usually when that phrase is used, when people say like, oh, games have to be fun or whatever, I feel like when that phrase is used, it's kind of this flattening viewpoint of like, games have to be fun. But I'm not really meaning that. I just mean that if we want to define a distinction between play and interactivity, of which play is like a subset of interactivity, then I would say that play is the manifestation of joy through interaction, right? In which case, exploration makes total sense as like, that is what you are playing the game for. If that is the reason you are engaging with the medium, in order to explore, and that's like your process of joy, then of course it's playful. It might, but say if the game also had aspects of, I don't know, what's a really good like base level interaction, like pursuit, I guess. Like maybe if you didn't like pursuit, you would still be interacting via the mechanic of pursuit, but you wouldn't be, so to speak.
What I find really intriguing about the definition of play as joy is that it makes like the onus on who calls it play to the player, so that whether or not one player finds something enjoyable or not means whether or not the interactivity that they're using or experiencing is actually play.
But I mean, I think that's always going to be subjective, right? Like I don't think it's much of a fruitful exercise to argue, whether or not this game is playful or not, right? Like I feel like that's always a subjective metric. So in this case, I don't see how it would be much different,
Because when I think interactivity, I think of like something as simple as like an OK prompt. Like as long as you have something to do and you aren't a passive participant,
mm-hmm.
it makes it inherently like interactive. Therefore, like if everything is inherently interactive, if you're active, then everything's inherently playful. So then everything can be play.
I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah. I think you're right. But I think isn't that like sort of the same reason why like UI designers are like, oh, we need to make things playful, or like, oh, we need to make things reactive, right? Is because that reactivity that is often so reached for in traditionally non-playful spaces, like user experience design or whatever, is reaching toward, I think, the same play that we're talking about, right? Like, yeah, like clicking an OK button is like a very baseline example, but the way that OK buttons are designed in applications, I think, is often trying to gesture at the idea of them being fun, or sorry, being playful. Which, whatever. I know I just said this, but yeah, I mean, I do sort of think like if we're going to talk about play as a subset of interactivity, then we have to acknowledge that any sort of interactivity is someone's going to define it as play.
I mean, you think of, I'm immediately reminded of the things Apple has done with the iPhone's home button, the haptics that are in the iPhone that are constantly making everything feel as if it is, when you pull a window down, then it makes a little click, like there's physics inside the machine, which don't make sense. And it doesn't make sense in, cognitive space, but to your hand and to your like sense of awareness, it does make sense. And it feels there's a kinesthetic to it that feels sometimes playful or at least satisfying in that way. Not that I'm proposing that iOS is play, but I think there is something to that kind of design. It sort of does exist in this like user defined way.
Yeah, I guess like all I'm really trying to say there is that like if we want to define interactivity and if we want to define play, which I think is a big ridiculous ask in a lot of ways, like there has to be a sort of understanding that what we're talking about is more than just games, right? It's everything that is trying to be designed in such a way as to be responsive to the player, big air quotes around that, right? Like it kind of is weird to think about it that way, but yeah, of course, like iOS is designed as a playful experience because if we agree that play is some sort of rewarding experience built on top of interactivity, then of course a user experience designer would want to design that into even the most baseline of tasks, right? Especially when we're talking about like the hyper capitalist nature of like iOS and of sort of breadcrumbing out possible purchases via like pleasure and that sort of thing, like loot boxes, right?
Yeah, this is all very intriguing to me. I mean, this topic kind of ties into a lot of very personal things about like how I feel about the medium. I mean, I'm someone who insists on the term interactive for my own work, just because I didn't really want it to be bogged down in like the notion of a game, because I was seeing that game was definitely pointing to a certain subset of interactivity, whether or not we were supposedly acknowledging it. I mean, when we sit down and we play, games like Gone Home or games like everything, like the notion of like, oh, but it's not really a game, like comes up. And so to me, the question became, so what's a game then? And what isn't a game? Because like, if things are still interactive, then everything isn't a game, and the boundaries just aren't there. But they are for a subset of the subculture, or how we talk about interactive media in general.
Yeah, and I mean everything is a unique example, I think, in that a word has been coined for that kind of thing that I typically like. Digital toy is something I've heard everything referred to as. Same for mountain. But then there's games like Eulenspiel, which came out this year. I mentioned this last episode. I'm going to mention this fucking game on every episode of this podcast. This fucking dog opera. But Eulenspiel is a game that I think sort of uses the same mechanical language as everything, but there's no question of whether or not that's a game. So I think Dante's definitely really onto something with this like notion that the definition of play does exist exactly with the player, and then I guess if you're so inclined, then further down that line of thinking, the definition of game also sort of exists in the mind of the person doing the perceiving.
Okay, so my next question then will be, so how do we talk about these things now? Like, are they segregated in journalism, or are they given their own little space apart from, say, like, the latest AAA or the newest endocrine dispenser? Like,
I mean, yeah, I think this is definitely where I get more hypercritical of the way that games journalism operates. But the problem is, I don't think there really is that space, at least not in like mainstream games discussions, because mainstream games discussions online, they aren't built for that, so to speak. Like, I mean, if you think of like modern games journalism as a sort of like hybrid of like enthusiast press and like heartfelt journalism, then, or what's the term? It's like very personal, like journalism stuff. When we talked about new games journalism, right? Like that angle coupled with like the enthusiast press, like how many points out of 10 is this game or whatever. The thing is, neither of those have a strong critical bent. Like, I like both of those fine for what they do, I guess. It's just they're the sort of critical discussion that is kind of a prerequisite for talking about games or digital toys or game-like experiences or interactives or whatever we want to call this like nebulous subgenre. That sort of like critical bedrock is not. It's not. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist in traditional games journalism, but it's just very rare. And the problem is there isn't a great way to talk about that slots in nicely. But on the other hand, maybe that just means there needs to be more of an outlet for this stuff that's more like art criticism built instead of sort of investigative journalism or enthusiast press built, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's definitely. I've been feeling this for a few years now. That would be a really lovely avenue to see explored. There's a lot of barriers to it in terms of revenue and the model that we use for publishing now. But I think of the difference between Pitchfork, or what Pitchfork is now, and of a magazine like The Wire. The Wire is a really good place if you want to find really underground experimental music that maybe 15 people have heard outside of that publication or their listenership, right? Or their readership. Pitchfork is now more than ever a website for pop music. And sometimes the coverage intersects between these things. Sometimes Pitchfork will elevate a One No Tricks Point Never or what have you that sort of hits that poppy realm. But typically, you're getting the weird underground Indonesian noise music out of The Wire. Like you're getting that sometimes more raw, sometimes more flawed experimental work from one of these places that is more equipped to just drill down into obscuria. And I don't know what the model or space for that in games looks like, especially because The Wire's a 37-year-old publication or so. So it's still a print magazine. So that's, it's one of those that can actually survive doing that.
Yeah.
Knock on wood.
Well, I was going to say, like, pour one out for Arcade Review every day because that was, I think, sort of, that's the sort of space where where I think what we're talking about would have really flourished, right? Is effectively an arts magazine that catered towards digital arts, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, okay, so where I want to start is that for me, I know that these forms of play or of non-play interactivity generally get termed walking simulators. And I like to posit that this is somewhat derogatory because it privileges certain modes of play. That because exploration is a form of play that isn't inherently evocative or visceral, that form of play gets put into its own little category and treated as like a secondary thing with the rest of the indies on itch.io, where in quotes you'll see some crazy shit, man. And so to me, like, I think that like these forms of interactives or of games like do have a home in the current enthusiast press. It's just that we seem to privilege the sorts of releases that bundle like action mode games or action mode play with reward systems. Whereas like it's all a form of activity, and therefore it's all a form of play if it's just considered on an equal point.
I think something that you said really resonated with me, which is that I do think that in a lot of ways this comes down to reward systems, right? Like this is when we think about the difference between a weird itch.io weird game or whatever, right? Like what is usually actually being said there is that this game doesn't manifest rewards to the player in the same way that more mainstream titles do. Like even Gone Home, which is like by all standards pretty weird in the AAA space, still is basically a game about finding audio logs. It's just about kind of determining the right like place to stand to get the right audio log, and then you get the audio log and it's like, good job, you got it, and here's a little bit more of the story, and then you keep moving. But it has a finite end, right? It has a very parsable story. And it was still considered like radical in the AAA space because it didn't have a lot of, I don't know, visceral interactive moments. But as we go into like more digital toy space, quote unquote, those things even have less of that, right? And they're meant to because the experience of the reward is meant to be sort of more intrinsic. It's like you're here, you're exploring this, you're finding whatever you want out of it, and then you're retiring the object because you've gotten your satisfaction, and the game didn't tell you that satisfaction. Like what's that? There's a famous, really stupid comment that someone left on the Her Story like Steam forums, where someone had said like, how do we know when the game's over? And then like
how do I know when I'm
exactly
satisfied?
How do I know when the game's over? And someone's like, when you're satisfied. He's like, how do I know I'm satisfied? So I think that's often the problem is that there's not a sort of like, people are trained to believe that video games exist as a sort of reward mechanism after a systems interaction. And that's not, strictly speaking, that doesn't change in digital toys. It's just both of those things, I think, become more subtle, or they become more on the onus of the player and not on the onus of the interactive, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking, you've got me now, Dante. This is sort of not a non sequitur, but your mention of the AAA space versus this digital toy space, I got to thinking about one of my other favorite games, Shenmue, which people talk Shenmue to death because it's a AAA game, and it's focusing on things that are shoddy in their presentation, kind of. So that's why people deride it. But Shenmue is a game that allows you to play it like it's a digital toy. It's a game that allows you to just kind of walk around, dicking around doing stuff and just looking at things. And so often that is what is rewarding about that game, is just looking at the little tiny details that, AM2 put in little corners of the game. But when that kind of game is presented at such a level, highly elevated, this is the most expensive game ever made. It's why the Dreamcast exists, blah, blah, blah. Once a game is presented as that, when an audience receives all of that messaging and then gets the actual game in hand, there's a disconnect there that I don't think people really know how to parse. I don't know that separating those two ideas of what this thing is.
Well, I mean, I totally agree. It also makes me. There was a discussion on another podcast I was listening to recently about how this sort of plagues. What do you? Wow, I'm blanking on the term right now. 0451 games, whatever. You know what I mean? What are those called, and why am I blanking on it? Deus Ex games, System Shock games. Why am I blanking on the term for these? Yes,
Looking Glass, Sandstorm.
Those games, like Prey or whatever, right? Like Prey that came out this year. Immersive Sims. Thank you. That is the term I was looking for. Okay, what I meant is immersive sims sort of have this problem, but in a weird other way, right? Because immersive sims traditionally are about sort of like, here's a range of options that you can use to tackle this diorama we have given you. And But when they're shown to the public, right? When they're shown at E3 or whatever, it's combat, because combat is showable, and it's like you get hyped because that's what video games are about. They're about like the cool guns you get and stuff. And then in reality, there's a bit of a sort of player whiplash, because they'll get into these games and realize that, oh, that's not really what's going on here. Like, that is one aspect of this game, sure, but it's not the majority of the play experience or the interaction experience. And I think for something like Shenmue, which is, this very weird game, it's a game very deeply obsessed with kind of a minutiae of this space. But when Shenmue 3 is announced, like, that's not really what you see in the trailer. Like,
right.
Oh, I'm
probably gonna hate that game. I can just tell from now, because it's gonna be the same exact game as Shenmue 1 and 2.
I mean,
and nobody wants that.
I would say that there's a lot of people who do want it, but the vast majority of gamers are going to think it's this hot, cool, I don't know, action game or something. Like, and that is absolutely not what that game is going to be. And I don't think this is a problem unique to even any genre or any even like grand subset of games. I think this is a problem with kind of just AAA mainstream whatever game penetration in the critical space, period, right? Like, there's the reason that Shenmue 3 is not marketed as a weird walk-around game is because that is not what the vast marketplace has been trained to expect from a high-budget video game, which is kind of a bummer.
I think it punishes us too. I mean, at least me personally, like, I have to speak to this media that is by and large against anything that isn't the high budget 300 member studio kind of set of interactive systems and rules and reward systems. Like, I make these like riffs on common computer interfaces that sort of challenge the notion of normal interactivity and make it all into a nicely framed little story. And so unless I learn to give the language of play, like to give a multiple playthrough to a player, something that makes them hooked in and think that there is a reward, like the chance of coverage is a bit lower because there isn't a venue. Yeah,
and I think that's extremely frustrating from a developer side of things. I completely agree. I mean, the only salve I feel like is true in this case is that, well, we are seeing that in many ways the field of interactive media is widening in a really good way. Like, there's a lot of really cool stuff coming out that doesn't need to market itself toward the same audience that is interested in the next Call of Duty or whatever. And this also, like, I feel like I'm just saying the same thing that we've been saying for like 10 years in the game space. It's like, isn't it cool that indie games exist now? But like, but that also means like there's going to be people interested in more, like, obscure is not really the right word, but maybe like there's people interested in more like esoteric methods of interaction with interactive media. I'm avoiding saying the word game here for a reason, but I think that like,
what's the reason?
Well,
what's the reason?
The reason is very specifically because we called them digital toys earlier, and I feel like I think that's a good term because they aren't. I mean, I don't want to go into what is a game exactly, but like they don't adhere to the same expectations of mainstream traditional game design. Like, that much I will say for sure.
Yeah,
right.
A museum isn't a game.
Okay, that's I completely agree. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because I just went to like this really like fancy new museum recently. I was in Anchorage, Alaska, and I went to the Anchorage Museum, and first of all, it's really cool. I highly recommend going if you're ever in Alaska. But they just got this new wing with like these, you know, super fancy new exhibits, and there's like a million like computers and like interactive screens and stuff. And it got me realizing that like, and this isn't a new observation, other people have said this, but like museums are really fascinating examples of game design in that they're about, you know, subtly guiding people through spaces. My favorite part of it, and it was something that was like, oh, this is a thing that some fucking indie game would do, is they had this dark room off to the side, but it was guided, you were guided to it in such a way that it wasn't like you aren't supposed to go here. It was like, no, there's things here. Like there were little breadcrumbs, like there was a certain lighting in the corner of the room, but mostly the entire room was black. And if you walked into it, the minute you walked in, there was like a slight motion sensor that turned on this like fake fireplace in the center. So as you walk in, this fireplace roars up, and then you realize that light that you saw in the corner was a screen that's facing away from you, so you can walk around to it and then you can see it. And it was just this great tiny example of like using a space to sort of prod a player into discovering it for themselves, without like strong arming them into like, here's the next room, look at it. And I think museums are absolutely fascinating in that way, because they are that. They're a self-guided experience with there's no reward at the end. It's just like, look at this thing, look at this thing, look at this thing. Leave when you're satisfied.
I wish every game had leave when you're satisfied.
That'd be great.
As a final instruction.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very Dark Souls.
It's the Dark Souls of museums.
Yeah.
So this ties into the last question, which is perhaps a little frustrating to hear, but if play is inevitable, then is game a good catch-all? Like, is that the best thing we got? Because you seem to have convinced me of the complete opposite I've been espousing for years. In that, like, I've been focused so hard on calling these things interactives that if the notion of play is joy, and if like the notion of like what brings you joy is player centered, then anything interactive is a game if you like it. So to me, the problem then became what we associate the word game with, or what the sort of shorthand game has become. Which is to say, you know, game is an action mode, reward-centered, player-centered form of interactivity. When anything and everything is a game if it's playful.
I mean, I do think that, one, you're obviously free to like define these things as you want. Like, I personally just feel like that viewpoint that everything's sort of a game is. Like, that is sort of my personal philosophy, and the reason that I think so is because I think it is sort of freeing. It's freeing to say that, like, hey, we can gain a cool game design concept from looking at a museum. I mean, that's not really new, but let's say a weirder example. Like, you can gain a cool game design experience. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to go into like a tiny tangent story, but I promise it's related. But
let's hear it.
A couple of years ago, when I was first like getting into game development, me and a group of other kids who were all like making indie games at the same time and stuff, we had this stupid joke where whenever we saw something that we thought was cool, we would just say it has really good game feel. And we would say that for everything. And it was sort of a joke, but we were also like, man, that branch does look really cool. Like, that's cool game feel. I like how that tree looks, you know, like I like how pressing the pedal in a car feels. Like, great game feel. This car's got great game feel. And like and we realized, like, yeah, you can draw experience from all those things, and you can actually put them into your experiences, your games, your whatever. And so yeah, like on a personal level, I do think that any sort of user experience that is trying to draw out a sense of playfulness is, in a vague sense, a game. Like, it's not a perfect description, but also I don't think we're ever going to have one. So, but I guess to that end, I would, like, for me personally, I do just call games. And by that I mean, like, if you're making a thing that I play on a computer, I'm probably going to call it a game unless the developer has specified otherwise. And like, I'll respect the developer in that case for sure. But as a broad catch-all, I don't really see a problem with it, I guess. I mean, it's more of a traditionalism thing at this point. Like, obviously, there's a wild difference between, like, I don't know, tennis and a digital toy, right? Like, they have completely different goals. One is played in a physical space, one is played in a digital space. But I guess I don't feel much of an issue with calling them games, you know?
Yeah, I mean, as a student of music, you know, I draw a lot of inspiration in my own work and just in kind of life from, you know, John Cage and Fluxus and, you know, art movements like that sort of ask, you know, how is dance different than painting, different than television, different than sculpture, you know, basically that there's not really any difference other than the how we approach it. Like it's our problem to deal with, not the work. The work is still a expression. It's still a communication outside of ourselves, you know, between two people, and that remains constant. So I don't see any reason why. I agree that game is kind of a freeing term and that you can just, you know, put it and walk away. This is a game. Okay. So, But what's interesting about it? Like, great. I'm not really interested in getting into like, well, what is this play satisfying in the way that I expect a game to like? No. So yeah, I agree that it is. I agree that it is freeing. And yeah, I mean, as to that tangent about game feel, like I always tend to think of things kind of in a similar way, like, you know, the arrangement of things in a building being something, you know, from my perspective as an observer of like how things are on a shelf, like that is an aesthetic experience. If I'm paying really close attention to it, I'm scrutinizing and taking in and reacting to, right? Like that is in itself a tiny window of experience. And then you move out of that back into like your daily life. And then you move in and out of these things constantly, right? So I don't see how those things aren't relevant to game design or digital sculpture, digital toys. I think that that's a very similar set of interactions and relationships.
Yeah, I think that the notion of like, you know, defining what is a game, like a question that has been discussed so widely that it's sort of a cliche among certain outlets. Like the only reason that it's important in this conversation is that the shorthand definition of a game has been used against a burgeoning like new kind of game or a new form of play, like whole new ways of expressing interactive experiences. Like when anything on your desktop could lead you down a hole that brings you joy or lets you explore something, then a game could be like a bunch of websites. A game could be like a really intriguing book. Like a game could be anything. As long as I have to do something, as long as I'm not just sitting and it's done, like as long as I'm more than a passive participant, that's enough. But when it comes to, say, you know, the field of journalism and how the industry as a whole is going to be discussing these things and qualifying these things and categorizing these things and qualifying these things, then that definition has to come up because it's being used against me and against other developers.
Yeah, and I think that is sort of why I totally feel you on that, and I do think that that's sort of why I'm so adamant about anything being a game, if that makes sense. Because I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about like, say, mainstream games journalism, right? How a game is defined is going to determine what they cover. If we're calling it games journalism, then they journalize about games. But if we can broaden that definition to the point where it's more like, who cares, dude? Like, then I think that offers a much wider range of things to be covered. Does that make sense? I think the question of what is games that happens in like the mainstream every 2 years of like, oh, is this new experimental walking simulator? Is that a game? It's like, yeah, of course it's a game. Why? Because the developer said it was a game. Like that's like I find those sort of arguments to be pointless and also like demeaning to developers a lot of the time, because they'll be like saying that like, oh yeah, like this thing you made isn't a game, even though you are stridently saying that it is. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying in a sense is that I'm rejecting the categorization, because I feel like the categorization, like the act of categorization, not the categorization itself. I feel like the act of categorizing games requires creating a set of criteria, and for every criteria you can think of, there's going to be a game that breaks it, which is, just basic problems with categorization, I guess. But it's kind of dumb. But the only way that I can think about it is like, well, it's a game if it feels like one. Like, and it's not a game if it doesn't. Like, which is why I guess I'm so hard on the idea of subjectivity in these sort of definitions, because it's the only metric we have, right? Like, we don't really have any other good metrics. That's my long-winded thoughts on that.
Okay. Then I think that wraps it up for us, unless either of you have any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I really need to play Orchestrial. You're not. I know. I'm a bad cool dev. I know. I've been playing a lot of things recently. I feel like I've been really behind on kind of delving into experimental stuff. Usually, like once a month, I like to just go on to the front page of Itch.io and see what's happening, which is a really wonderful way to find weird games. But yeah, I don't know if I have any other major closing thoughts. This was a really delightful discussion. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being on. This has been really good.
Yeah. Christa, you take us out of here.
All right. Well, for everyone here, I've been Christa. You can find me on Twitter at @OhPoorPup.
I'm Sophia Park. You can find me on Twitter at Sophia Park _ Sophia with a PH.
And I'm Dante. You can find me on Twitter at VideoDante.
And this has been Metagame. You can find us on the web at metagame.fun. And if you like what we do, then please consider supporting us and joining the community on Discord, and get notifications on streams at patreon.com/metagame.fun. But that's all spelled out like a word. Likewise, Metagame on Twitter is metagame.fun as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. But is it a podcast?
Right.
Okay, thanks for joining us.